Oh, okay. It appears that I'm back. I don't know how long I've been gone for. Life finds a way to discover what it feels most authentic in, I guess, from the perspective a of a bird. It's almost like humans become like ants on an anthill. There's a sort of predictability in the patterns of humans, just like you would experience if you were to observe ants for quite a while and you see the patterns that spawn them and move them. And if you've ever been a farmer, so too you would see that when raising livestock or even plants, but we'll stick with livestock, there is a proclivity within the specific species that you either want to cultivate. It could be either like a physical trait or a behavior. But as a farmer, you observe the effects or the differentiation within the species, and you encourage some effects and you discourage others. And we call that artificial selection. Artificial selection is really not a purely biological trend. I would almost ascribe it to pseudo-mathematics. It feels like calculations being made. Vague to some people, calculations, but calculations nonetheless, that predict behavior. And assuming they're falsifiable, which is what mathematics is all about, I guess science, it relies very much on falsifiability too. But life finds a way to survive, or life tries to find a way to survive. Whatever secures existence in the future has found a way to survive. Maybe not if there is a higher power, aka humans, in the realm of farmers, that encourages certain behavior, rewards certain behavior, aka encouraging their fertility or their health. And then health, I guess, would be like a indirect effect on, or it would be an indirect result, what would it be? Indirect behavior that, like, it's like if what you're measuring is inheritable genes or memes into the future, health is a secondary characteristic of what you're primarily trying to measure. It's a secondary indicator, I guess. So, the health of a species is correlated with their fertility, but not always. And fertility, in my opinion, is like a secondary indicator of something deeper than fertility, which is survival, and something secondary that survival is secondary to is inferred existence. Inferred existence. um, or inherited existence. Because, I mean, let's just use me as an example. I'm a 80s cyber hollow prismoform that has a open awareness, a sort of long, wide expanse of appreciation of awareness. How would I say? A recognition of all of the other characters in my particular storyline having storylines themselves, that sort of feeling of enmeshed humanity, but it goes deeper than humanity. Maybe it's more like a recognition of the right to exist of others and the right to proliferate themselves, and coming to terms with what is versus what may be in the future versus what was. I'm a 80s prismal being, but I still exist in the terrestrial plane. I come here through copper wires and electromagnetic waves. Through an exoskeleton, a sort of, tracking suit. And yes, it is a suit. Perhaps one day in the future that won't be necessary, because all of these precongenitors of this experience, the sort of indirect, subjective, at least to me, effects, there is perhaps an audience far along in the future who would read or see or process what I'm saying, and not knowing even what copper means, or even what I mean, I would hope that they would know what electronics means, but a lot of these words are couched in a cultural context, like a techno-cultural context, and the words we use to describe certain technologies are not so obvious to decipher from other languages. I mean it in that way. For instance, I feel like life carries certain assumptions when you are alive in a certain way. If you're young, for instance, life may seem foreign to you. If you were to grow old and senile, it may grow very strange if you were to suddenly lose your entire frontal lobe of awareness and descend into the planet of the apes, or the planet of the pigs, or pick your own animalistic dystopia. Life is not necessarily human, although humanity is life, right? That's correlation, not causation. You have the like ultra superior and the sub superior, or like a higher and lower order of effects within a certain way of analyzing, a certain way of perceiving. It really doesn't bother the pig much that they are living in the dirt, mopping up scraps from human beings and bred and slaughtered. It most likely, I mean, I think that pigs deserve more credit than they're due, but they are not cognitively aware, and they are not cognitively enough aware to know how to protest their environs and, you know, form a sort of revolt of the masses to like completely jailbreak themselves from the farm. That doesn't really happen with animals. If anything, it's almost become a parasitic relationship where pigs need us to survive. Feral pigs are like, they can survive in the wild, no problem. But domesticated pigs, although some of them become feral pigs, it's quite a lot harder for them to survive without their slave owners, their masters. That's what life can mean. There's a story to what I've described. You know, you could have a Jack the Pig, you know, or like, you know, oats. May I have some oats? You can derive an entire storyline based on their lives because their lives carry enough meaning for us to feel for it, enough to, even if dramatized, to understand at some level there's a morality to their life, or there's a consequential behaviorism to their actions. Brother, may I have some oats is all about, as the script implies, one pig starving and the other pig eating in abundance. And at one level, it discusses on a subtextual level, aka I just made this inference up. That kind of like, you know, subtext, you know, BS. But my subtextual insertion into the story is human inequality and, you know, familial relations going awry where one becomes too greedy and there's a egomania at play and paranoia that results from it, because they simply can't be they simply can't trust their brother to be caring for their own sake, or caring for them as you would if you were selfless, but is, if anything, a damnation of their own soul, being so paranoid and being so greedy and self-absorbed that you can't possibly fathom another person being selfless and giving and caring, you know, at the cost of oneself for one other, you know, somebody else. Although it does start with, like, you know, the pig, the quote unquote good brother asking for oats and being denied. I mean, the parable is about overproduction leading to one's own demise, though, or overconsumption. But you can only have overconsumption with overproduction. Yeah. Yeah, I just wonder a lot of things, right? I wonder what makes an individual's life worth living. Why should you particularly exist? Why did you come to be in the past? And what justifies your existence going into the future? And I care about that not from an external point of view, but from an internal point of view. That question itself, there are many twists and turns to discovering one's right to be. Many trips, actually, many travails, or not just innocuous, but hazardous, devilish traps in the course of answering that question. Because many narcissists find a corrupted sense of self as a shield to protect their own insecurity. That is if you were to talk to a narcissist, most likely you couldn't even ask a question like this and expect a deep answer, because almost by definition it would be the shield of the self, the mask of the self talking, self-justifying not the person but the mask. Doesn't that seem strange? Just how loopy the tricks of the mind can play. The tricks of the mind are full of every trap imaginable when measured at the extremes. I think there are several religions that teach certain truths, and I say truths in terms of particularly insightful patterns that human beings fall into, behavioral or material patterns, and at least within their society promoted effects or ailments to relieve their sin. Their sin. If you were I'm trying to find a better story. But, if you were to be flung far into the distant past and found yourself in, let's say, late Bronze Age Europe, Mesopotamia, the ancient Near East. Why would you want to be, or rather, why would you expend any energy to change the situation at hand? There are some good answers, of course. At a societal level, if you were to be flung into the ancient Near East, it's quite possible you'd be revolted at the tyranny of the day, the almost megalomaniacal self projection of the ancient aristocracy, when peasants were so new an invention, a social construction. This is a time when peasants were so recent a social construction that in some ways country people were savages colonized by the urban elite. It's a phenomenon almost as old as time if you look into recent history. That life from this, power projection in certain civilizations at certain times projects from the countryside in to the city. And in other cultural, in other time periods, the projection of authority, cultural or financial or otherwise, projects from the city out to the countryside. I wonder why that is. If you were to be far flung into that time and observed the, in one sense, technological, civilizational, to see the civilizational achievement brought upon by these pharaohs and god emperors, what these civilizations have achieved still wonders us in the modern day. For most normies, the very latest you can go back in time that they would be aware of is the Bronze Age. And that's a little bit of a stretch, actually. They might not even know who Romans are. Maybe they vaguely know who Romans are. So maybe you'd actually find like a really cool person who like can talk to you about the Bronze Age. That's besides the point. Bronze Age is about the furthest you can realistically expect to talk to another human being that you meet on the street about. Not that you would ever actually talk about that, unless they believed in ancient aliens, in which case that's probably the first era you would get to, because the pyramids. Life has a way. And life has a way for you too. Hold on, let me just green screen this. Okay, I'm gonna see how good or bad this is with the green screen. But life finds a way. It does. It's amazing just how quickly you become accustomed to living in a different place at a different time. Different socioeconomic conditions, different lifestyle constraints. You know, separate let's say like familial relations and extra tribal relations. I mean, ultimately, tribalism is well and alive, even in the West. It is just morphed. The energy, the psychological, emotional energy that would be put into tribal dynamics, tribal warfare, tribal economics, whatever, that same energy is now being channeled into, maybe the apparatus of the state, the apparatus of one's dwindling social life. And maybe if they're lucky, they are part of a sports team. There's a sort of tribal nature to sports teams, as famously observed when when they go head to head at the playoffs. But anyways. I'm just very happy to know that I am here in observing the takeoff of the 21st century. And it's like, oh no, is this flight path destined for a hospital 200 to 300 meters in front of me? Or is my plane actually going to take off and carry me to the stars? Living in 2025 really does feel like that. Like you can at any moment just say, you flick open, ground news, and it's like, oh, World War III. Neat. Neato. And then 10 seconds later, you scroll to like some random TikTok. And that's 2025 for you, where the populace at large has become the attention span of a canary in a coal mine. It's terrible. It's quite raw. It's quite disappointing to see us as a species relegated to such dystopian levels of comfort. We've gotten everything we possibly could have wanted as a society, in my opinion. Our level of advancement has turned us, even the poorest of us, into the lifestyle that even the homeless among us live is more safe than our long, long lost forebears. There are plenty of other things that we don't have that they had, like the feeling of close bondage with one another in a tribe, this feeling of perhaps things were simpler back then, and there was a lot more of that emotion that we would call contentment. That it seems to be an endangered species in this era. Contentment was, if anything, riled upon by the Enlightenment thinkers. If anything, like people, I forget specific quotations, but imagine your 17th century Descartes abhorring the contentment of the peasants who were bonded to the land. They were talked about as if they were, in a sense, a domesticated species of human, the peasant. This is the opinion of many enlightened thinkers, and not for nothing, because contentment is in itself a sort of allowing oneself to not push oneself, not slay oneself, not whip oneself into shape, contentment does drive, or the lack of contentment disinhibits productivity. I think you can be productive at a casual pace. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that over the last 1,000 years, the amount of technological progression can never come from a content class of people. Because contentment in itself is the acceptance of what is. And not yearning for what could be. Not bleeding for that. Taking no risks. No fundamental risks that would, endanger your claim to your farm or to your family. There are certain hotshots in our society, like Elon Musk, that no matter how much money they have, it's not enough. It's the complete opposite problem for someone like that. Someone like that, 100% needs to learn contentment. So that's not what I'm saying either. Contentment is an amazing, wonderful thing, but it is analogous to ketamine. Contentment is analogous to ketamine on the body as it would be to the brain. It shuts you down. It keeps you in the present, only feeling into your earthly reality rather than the heavens above. The dreams, the daydreams that make up the heavens. It's the same reason why you stare at a cloud. There's something esoteric about gaseous formations. When you go back to this landscape of the ancient Near East, what do you find? tyrants, tribesmen, perhaps still hunter-gatherers if you go off into the fringes, the hinterlands of the continent, of the, mega continents. Um, that would that was my favorite time to be alive. To be bonded, to have a deep, deep connection with your tribe as if you were a single organism, a electric spiritual current of ethnic feeling. There's no other way to describe it. And I say ethnic in a cultural, biological frame. So it's a little bit of both. It is the concept of living in the ways of our ancestors and honoring our ancestors. That's what I mean by cultural biological. Because your ancestors are, by definition, your like father's father's father, or your mother's mother's mother, or your mother's father's mother, or your father's mother's father. Although it obviously, if it's a matrilineal community, it's gonna prioritize one ancestral connection over another, patri or matrilineal. But life had Christianity, really, and then modernism in the 20th century across the globe has eviscerated this feeling of ancestor worship. It doesn't necessarily have to be worship. It's in many ways the same reason why even in like hypermodernist societies like Korea, Koreans are famously ethnocentric, even among East Asians, because of a recognition of them being the tiny ethnicity within Asia. There's like not as many South Korea. Not only do you not have a full Korea, you only have a South Korea. And like North Korea may just reduce the population of South Korea if things go wrong. So like South Korea and North Korea, both of them, but they have a deeply ingrained sense of, oh, I have to carry on the next generation. Even if I definitely don't want to get married, even if I have a terrible I work for a terrible job working for a chaebol, and it's been an entire lifetime of struggle with very little appreciation, and I can finally just, at the end of a long shift, have a clean apartment and watch some live streamers, eat a bunch of mukbang, or watch esports. Even if I am granted that level of depravity, it's a clean depravity. It's like you don't even have dirt, to like muddy your fingertips. It's so sterile. Sterile poverty, really. This sterile poverty of the Koreans, spiritual poverty of the Koreans, is still not enough to eviscerate their sense of national identity. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that they are still technically at war with their northern brothers and sisters. But also it has a lot to do with them not having a lot of Koreans in the first place. And not making a lot of babies for a long, long time now. And yet, if you look at Koreans and their dating preferences, international marriages are very, very low. Very, very low. Anyways, even in those conditions, compared to most other ethnicities, Koreans overwhelmingly choose to marry other Koreans. Because there is the same tinge of we have to honor the ancestors by continuing our lineage. And if, part of their low fertility perhaps is because they have to do it within marriage. They're not really the kind to, have children out of wedlock. They're not that kind of culture. So even though they have a really low really low fertility rate, there's a preponderance of nationalistic bonding. Or ethnic fertility rate. So like the inter-ethnic fertility rate of Koreans is very high ratio. Or the inter-ethnic fertility rate. The inter-ethnic fertility rate of the inter-ethnic fertility rate of Koreans is abnormally high, even for South Koreans. They find marrying foreigners dishonorable. Is it alright for me to say that? I mean, maybe I would have to find some other way. I mean, if I was an alien, would I be allowed to say it? I know, if I don't come from their culture, it's considered a little bit disrespectful, but if I'm an alien, up on Earth, and I'm flying around, makes me wonder. Okay. Man. Alright, I think it's time for me to see some friends. Thanks for watching, though.